welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
And me, Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
Our guest today is Molly Peacock. Molly Peacock is the author of 8 volumes of poetry. Earlier titles include The Analyst, Poems, and Cornucopia, New and Selected Poems. She joins us today to talk about her latest collection, The Widow's Crayon Box. She also recently wrote a nonfiction book about friendship, A Friend Sails In on a Poem, published by Windsor-based Palimpsest Press. As a poetry activist, Peacock was the co-founder of Poetry in Motion on New York's subways and buses, the founder of the Best Canadian Poetry series, and the creator of the Secret Poetry Room at Binghamton University. Welcome, Molly.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for asking me.
You've talked about how you cried every day for a full moon cycle after your husband, Michael Groden, died. And then the next day you got up and you didn't cry. What was that first day without tears like for you? And how did it possibly lead to this book?
It was such a strange happening because while I was crying for 28 days, I would say to myself, are you going to stop now? Is this going to go on forever? And when I woke up on the 29th day, I wasn't aware of not crying for a while. It was late in the afternoon, and I thought, whoa, now I know why today is different. You haven't broken down in sobs. And that was the beginning of the turn. I was becoming a widow. I was still a wife for those 28 days when I was crying. The waking up into a sense of who I am after my husband's death began to happen then. I started writing poems about that just before. I think I was still crying and writing. And the book is organized in 4 parts. And the last section is called Afterglow. And I actually wrote the poem Afterglow first. But I didn't, of course I didn't know it was going to be the first poem in a book. I just began to write because I thought, and I still think this, I know that people process loss without making an art, but I actually don't know how they do that. I feel like I myself have to make something, say something, write something. And I began probably just a couple of weeks after Mike died.
The title poem, The Widow's Crayon Box, talks about your expectation that a widow's life would be colorless and drab. Then you get a phone call from someone else who saw your husband, perhaps his ghost, on their morning run, and suddenly you're seeing red, vermilion to be precise. What else about this stage in life has been a surprise, and how have you dealt with it in your work?
Well, I have to say, it was such a shock to receive that phone call. From another poet in the United States, Carolyn Hill, and for her to see this vision of my husband. And I was very proprietary about the visions of my husband. I wanted to be the only person who had them. And that was a spark to me. This sense that a widow should be dressed in a mauve bathrobe, tucked away at the end of a couch, sobbing, it's a common cultural image. And I thought maybe that's how it would be. But I felt such a variety of feeling. I was joyful in my memories. I was thrilled to be so relieved because I was a caretaker for quite a while. And I felt guilty about the relief that I felt. I absolutely adored my husband, and we knew each other since we were teenagers. We got married in our mid 40s, but I had known him. He died when he was in his early 70s, and I had known him. I first saw him when we were 13. So it was a long relationship, and part of the many different colors of the crayon box I was feeling is all of those different emotions that I was having now that also recalled previous emotions. So the mauve thing, I thought, gee, I'm feeling much more in the primary color range. And then I thought, this is not just the 8-color crayon box. I'm feeling the entire 152. And I went on to, there are wonderful websites that are tributes to crayon boxes and crayon colors. And I began writing poems that incorporated the names of those colors because I was writing very immediately out of my own experience. And in order to do that, in the beginning, especially for the title poem, The Widow's Crayon Box, I stuck to the sonnet and the sonnet sequence.
That's very interesting. You bring up the type of poem. So the poems that you mentioned are linked. They're structural. They're linked by color, emotions or color, as you mentioned. And in The Widow in the Kitchen with the Yellow Apple, color seems a framework for memory. So structurally, how did you format these sonnets, the structure of the poems to help you explore the experience of death and loss? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. I'm a morning writer. I write by hand on a purple legal pad, and I was so all over the place. I just felt like I didn't have any contours at all. And the sonnet is so helpful. It gives you some contours, even if you don't rhyme it or what have you, just to know that you're going to do something like approximating 14 lines. It's very helpful. And so what I did, I'd never written sonnet sequences before. And I thought, well, why don't you try that? You're living a new life. Try a new method. So I wrote the first poem that starts off, a mourning widow is still gray and mauve. A mourning widow umber barely moves. And I thought, well, I'll get to the end of this. Somehow I'll get to the end. And almost immediately after my husband died, I had to do our taxes. And as a feminist, I hate to admit this, but we had a very sexist division of labor in our marriage. And even though I kept all the receipts, he actually prepared he prepared an Excel spreadsheet for the tax preparer. And I'm looking at this Excel spreadsheet, having a nervous breakdown. And, but I thought, I'm throwing that into the poem too. I say, hey, get back here, help me do our taxes. Your mourning widow never relaxes, because rhyme is helpful. And then in the end of that sonnet, I cry. I say that colors are shielding me from my own tears, and then I yield. And if you do a sonnet sequence, then the next day, or I didn't write one every day, often it would be the next week I would write one, and I would turn back and say, well, what's my last line? And I thought, okay, I'm going to capture some of the language of my last line in the first line of the next sonnet. And that's what I did. I wrote, I yield to a turquoise sky, becoming young.
So you touched on this a little bit earlier, that the book kind of moves back and forth in time rather fluidly. Even the entire section after
Yes.
is first and then followed by before, your memories of you both as young people. Why did that flow feel right to you at this moment in time?
Because in the shock of the loss of a beloved person, time does lots of strange things. And I wrote these poems in no particular order. Whatever consumed me at the time, I wrote it. And I had written poems while he was ill. Not a lot, because it was just too crazy. And I should tell you that my late husband was a melanoma survivor for 40 years. So even when we got married, when we were 45, I knew that. I mean, in some ways I was prepared, and in some ways I lived with this for a long time. It was a fact of our lives, and there'd be a recurrence, a lot of crazy hospital visits, and then everything would calm down again. And that would happen about every 6 years. So until the last recurrence, which was in 2015, and then there were medical complications all the way through till 2021, which also happened during COVID. So it was a really challenging time. In all of that, that the sense of time keeps changing. And certainly right after he died, I'm writing poems about being alone after, but when I'm putting the book together, I realize I'm telling a story here. A lot of poets don't think of themselves as telling stories, but I have a narrative impulse, and I also have another life as a biographer. And I love biography. I love the shapes of people's lives, and I love communicating about them. And I have a sense of my poems as mini histories. And when I put the book together, okay, I thought I'm going to take the full out emotion of the poems that happened afterwards, and then I'm going to have a flashback, just as if the book were structured as a film. Not that you're going to see a movie of the Widow's Crayon box, but so when I went backwards, I turned to the poems that I had written during Mike's illness and plucked those out. And then, of course, I wrote poems, and I gave myself little assignments. I would say to myself, well, what about the actual death? What about your feelings then? What about your sense of him? Do you have a sense of where he is? And I would think, okay, I'm going to write a poem about that. And that became, so in the construction of the book, it begins with after, then goes to before, then goes to when. It's a small section of his actual death and cremation, and then goes to afterglow, which are essentially the continuation of the waking up, my waking up after the quite momentous felling of a great tree in my life.
One of your poems, Threshold, is based on a memory of starting your life together. You write, "And I didn't have to make the scene up. Water, sapphire, peaks, quartz. It wasn't art, but a threshold, and we'd arrived there." Is that how you saw the scene at the time? And how does turning a memory into a poem make it more vivid or meaningful?
You hit on one of the essential questions in poetry. I do think that poetry is an act of memorialization, and I do think that memory is a key factor in poetry, even when the poem doesn't seem to be about a memory. But here it directly is. And I have to say, when we got married, we went down to the States to get married because we were going to get married in Victoria, and they needed all of our previous divorce papers. And we both had been married like decades before, and we were digging out these papers thinking, is this the right thing? Is that the right thing? And I called this place, Port Angeles, Washington, and I realized, I thought, we can take a ferry to Port Angeles and we can get married there because all you need is 4 days residency. So great, we'll do it. And we planned our little honeymoon afterwards, and we were at this perfectly gorgeous old-fashioned inn in a state park. And I woke up and there were these old-fashioned shutters on the windows, and I opened them and I saw that lake, and I thought, this is so incredible to see this framed scene. It was like it was a living painting in front of me, because it had that window frame dimensions. And I didn't write this poem until 20 years later. And I think I wrote it near an anniversary, because we cherished our anniversaries. And I think I wrote it then to include in an anniversary card for him. So yes, it preserves the memories, and it's retrospective. I'm recalling it, but I'm also conjuring it up, and it's very vivid for me. So I hope the poem is as vivid. And I do say, I didn't have to make that up. People make up images, or images come to them, but I didn't make that up in the least. I tried to get at the reality of it. I love reality. That's another part of being a biographer.
Oh, well, as a Bloomsbury fan, fellow Bloomsbury fan, and sometimes we can't deal with too much reality, can we? You also reference Virginia Woolf and her mother, Julia Princep Stephen. Both women wrote books on illness. What was it about these two women and their writing that spoke to you when you were creating this book, do you think?
I wrote a sonnet sequence during a particularly terrible time in Mike's illness, when he was on this drug trial, and he was incredibly anxious, and anxiety is catching. Anxiety is as catching as a cold, as COVID. It's contagious, and I was constantly fending off that anxiety, because if he was anxious, I couldn't also be anxious. We'd just be a hysterical mess. And he wasn't hysterical. I was the hysteric. I am the hysteric, but he was anxious in his own more contained way. And I began this other sonnet sequence thinking that I had to cope with what the reality of caregiving. And there's also a myth about being a caregiver, that the wife is the tireless caregiver, having it all together. And my experience, frankly, in hospitals is that there's tremendous expectations put on a wife, largely by the nursing staff. You're supposed to be there. You're supposed to be doing certain things at the time, etc. You're 15 minutes late and you are a bad girl. And I would watch, say, a man whose wife was receiving treatment. He'd bring her a cup of Tim Hortons coffee, and everyone in the nurses' station would be saying, "What a guy! Isn't he terrific? Brought his wife this cup of coffee." And I'm there thinking, no one on earth would say, "What a woman, she brought her husband a cup of Tim Hortons." So I had a lot of anger. And I didn't want to slather that all over my husband. It wasn't his fault. I went back into therapy. I had to have a place to put all this. And the complexity of taking care of someone who didn't necessarily want to be taken care of. And I was treading this line between being a wife and being a caregiver, and that borders into being a mother. And I didn't want to be his mother, and he certainly didn't want me to be his mother. And all of that is circulating around. And then I happened to read Notes from Sick Rooms by Virginia Woolf's mother, Julia Princeps Stephen, and about nursing, and it's home nursing, caregiving. And these lines kept striking me. I thought of my mother being ill at home after having given birth to my sister. This obviously goes back decades and decades. And how I perceived that as a 3-year-old. All of these things were swimming back and forth, and another sonnet sequence occurred. Oh, well, so Virginia Woolf has also written on being ill, and it was my husband, my late husband, who suggested that I read that, because it is a mother-daughter dialogue, really.
The Widow's Crayon Box is not the first time you've tackled a tough subject in your work. What outcome are you reaching for when you tackle these kinds of topics poetically?
I'm not reaching for an outcome. It's a great question. I'm reaching inward toward the deepest emotional candor I can muster, and using that to fuel the poem. Especially those subjects that would make me angry, ashamed, full of love for a strange reason. Things that I'm perceiving about myself that I don't see reflected in the general culture, but I know they must be there because I'm human and I'm not that unique. That if I write it, somebody out there is going to recognize themselves in what I write. Not everybody. But if I write it as honestly as I can, I feel that my candor will be respected. That also I feel that my formal skills as a poet will be respected. So yes, I can write about a subject that's not normally written about in poetry, and I can have it regarded as a poem because I've gone the distance emotionally and with technique, so that I can be very as clear as I can about something. Not all poets value clarity. Clarity doesn't get written about, for instance, as much as obscurity does, because obscurity is so interpretable. And clarity, my kind of clarity at any rate, is emotionally clear as well as contextually clear. So it's a tricky business, but I value that. I value that in art so much when I encounter it, and I try to do it myself. So sure, there's an outcome, but I don't know what that outcome is going to be, Kim. I'm clueless. That is the wonderful and terrifying surprise of making art. You don't know. You just don't know.
Now that you've been through this experience, do you think that we should rethink the ideas that we have as a society about widowhood? If so, how?
Absolutely. Let's rethink it. It is, what an idea to, what a vision we have of widowhood, that somehow it's positively Victorian. And it was another reason why I use Virginia Woolf's mother. It is the sense of putting someone experiencing bereavement in a box is very helpful to the outside world, because it's very hard to anticipate what another person will be feeling. And so I get it. I get that someone who is in a state of bereavement can be hard to handle. And I say this freely, from having broken down crying in a bank, broken down crying in a bakery, the various places that I've had many breakdowns. But I do feel that I'm utterly alive, perfectly capable, and a magic thing happened. My widowhood returned me to my girlhood. My widowhood returned me to the place I was in before I met Mike, and certainly the place I was in before I had a first marriage, a young marriage in my 20s. I was in a place, and I am in a place of possibility. Widows can smile. Widows can be happy. Widows can be relieved. That's all part of the crayon box. And it's also part of adulthood to be able to feel two things at one time. Yes, you can be smiling and going to the gym at the same time as being sad and bereaved because you've lost someone important to you. Those combinations exist, and the expectation that your eyes are going to be downcast, that you're going to be moving slowly. It's not that I haven't experienced downcast eyes and slow movement, but it's that the bereavement is utterly, utterly human. And if you see somebody looking good and moving along to the market, it's not like she's forgotten the person who's died, but it is like, I mean, she's possessing her days. Death makes you really aware of life. It lets you repossess your days.
So this book is coming out in November 2024. Have you been able to start a new writing project yet? Are you working on anything specific?
Well, I have new poems. I never stop writing them. I have new poems of where I am now, what I'm thinking about now, and I have new poems about my cherished solitude. I I loved being married, but I also love my solo life. I don't think everyone turns to their solo life with the pleasure that I have, but I think I've sought that kind of solitude my whole life. And I've been living with people or had a life filled with obligations until now, and I'm really enjoying it. So there are poems that are coming out of this as well.
Would you like to read from the Widow's Crayon Box for our audience?
I would be very happy to read the first poem and the last poem. I had a hard time thinking about what would be the first poem in this book. And I finally landed on this. And I think that it opens up the conversation. It's called Touched. When I feel moved and then say I am touched, it's another presence inside me I sense. The dip of an oar, a canoe being launched. I'm the oar, but I'm the water, and sense at once initiation and response. After you died, I felt you next to me. And over months, you entered gradually into that lake and disappeared. Not gone, but so internalized, you're not next to me. You're not the port or the support. You're done being you. And my loneliness is so extreme that I feel moved by almost anything. Even the forehead of a dog that leans against my knees in an elevator. Things as brief as all the ways you would lean against me, getting a glass of water at the sink. Everything touches me now that I'm not touched, but moved. The lack of touch, that sudden lack of touch when you've lived with someone, slept with them every night, not necessarily a sexual touch, but that simply leaning into one another was a huge source of loneliness for me. But also the sense of internalizing my late husband. He's with me. I don't have to worry about that. I've absorbed him. But there's a lot of ritual around losing someone. And I'm going to read the last poem in the book called Honey Crisp. And this last poem was in the Walrus magazine. And I'm surprised to say it is the single poem that they've received the most email response to. And I think there are a lot of widows and widowers out there, and they were surprised to encounter a poem like this. It's called Honey Crisp, after the name of the apple, Honey Crisp. And I take a chance in the poem. I'm actually talking to an apple. Honey Crisp. Hello, wizen face. Hello, apple. Understudy in the fridge since March. It's September. Hello, wrinkly red cheeks. I'll I'll bet you're almost a year old, born last autumn, kept in the fruit storage built half underground on the farm, then in the snow, sold to me. Hello, my honey crisp. Well, my honey, no longer crisp. Are you asking why you haven't been eaten by now? Because that man hewed to his routines. An apple for lunch every day, the same red punctuation. You were earmarked for the date he slipped from my arms, and we both slid to the floor. Red Angel, are you listening? 911, hospital, hospice, and 10 days later, you were about 6 months old then. He died and was carried to a cold shelf. Hello, smiley stem. Hello, days, moving you from spot to spot. Hello, week, where I forgot and left you at the back and went about my new life. Greetings, new groceries. Their jumble causes a rearrangement of your bin. So I have to pick you up. Would you rather have been eaten and lived on as energy? Not yet. Not yet, my pum. Hello, soft, wrinkled face in my palms. Part of the mail that came after the poem was published was from people who also couldn't throw out strange talismanic things, including apples or other items of food in their refrigerator that they were unable to part with. I could not throw that apple in the compost bin. About a year after it had been in the fridge, and I have a really good refrigerator, so it just sort of dried, it really wrinkled and wrinkled and wrinkled and dried. And I thought, okay, in a ritualized way, near what would have been our wedding anniversary, I went out onto my balcony, and I have it's only 80 square feet, but it's in 2 tiers, and so it's heavily gardened. There's a lot out there, and I took one of the boxes and I buried it. I thought, okay, the apple is going to decompose in the roots of these geraniums, and it allowed me to make yet another transition among the many, many transitions of widowhood.
Molly Peacock, thank you so much for joining us today and bringing us your latest collection of poems, The Widow's Crayon Box.
Thank you so much for allowing me to read the poems and participate in this discussion.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.